Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 313. Is your day ruled by push notifications? Be honest. Could responding to notifications or checking email give you that sense of productivity, but really just be procrastination in disguise? Skye Waterson is a former academic turned business owner and ADHD coach, and she's joining us this week to provide a different perspective on ADHD with strategies that can help the ADHD brain and well beyond. In part one of our discussion with Skye, we're going to baseline our understanding of ADHD, and we'll talk about dopamine, motivation, and the importance of creating a routine. You'll also hear some of the unique challenges of working from home with ADHD. We'll talk about struggles with procrastination and how prioritization can help if you use the right kind of filter. What does that mean? Let's get to part one of our discussion with Skye Waterson. Skye Waterson, welcome to Nerd Journey.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Take just a second for us and introduce yourself to the listening audience, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Skye Waterson. I am a former academic, very nerdy in my former life, and I found out I had ADHD at the beginning of my PhD, and that really shifted me over into looking at ADHD as a research focus. So I did a bunch of research on ADHD, wrote about it on the internet. COVID hit, and I decided to start coaching. Loved it, developed it into a 6-figure business, and I recently transitioned. Now I work with just business owners who have ADHD and a few other people who ask me really nicely.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm thankful that we asked you nicely to be on the show, Skye, because while we have talked about ADHD with a couple other previous guests, John Towles and Kristen specifically, we wanted to take a little bit different path on this discussion with you. So let's just baseline our understanding. How would you define ADHD in terms of what it is and maybe what it isn't?
We can get into the research of it, and there's so much to get into. Really, at its baseline, ADHD is a persistent and pervasive struggle with executive functioning, which is what I really focus on, and also impulsivity, and more we're learning emotional dysregulation as well. And we know this is all coming from shifts in the brain. You can see that in the neuroscience. But if you're looking at how it's diagnosed, people will use the DSM-5. That's what we're using at the moment to diagnose ADHD.
DSM-5. Okay. And is that like a set of criteria or questions or checklist of symptoms?
Yeah. So it's a set of criteria and questions that you will get asked from a professional, usually a psychiatrist, occasionally somebody else, depending on your country. They will ask you those questions, and they have a book that you can find on the internet if you look really hard that will go through that criteria, and it talks through kind of things like, are you driven by a motor? Internally, do you have trouble sitting still? It's a little bit different for adults. They shift it depending on whether you're diagnosed as a child or an adult. When you're an adult, they're looking for if you've had this pervasively over time, which is a really important part of ADHD diagnosis. And then you've got two types. You can be primarily inattentive, which means you're it's not showing up, but you're more distracted. Primarily hyperactive, which is your classic, what you might imagine as ADHD. And then a combined type, which is me. I'm combined type.
Oh, wow. an interesting area where those types are going to play out is in our careers. Since we're talking to technology professionals out there, what do you think it looks like for someone who has ADHD in a technology field, working in a technology profession?
It can look like so many different things, first of all. It can look like Google, where there's lots of flexibility, there's lots of freedom, but you have to manage your own time and, not burn out. Or it can look like you're working maybe in a more traditional space where you might be working even in a government job, doing some kind of technology there, and then your problems are often they won't let you change the apps that you use. You have to deal with Microsoft in all its glory. And in some cases, I've worked with people who do very high-level things, say, for the government, and they don't even they can't even use their phones. So it depends on the level of flexibility, but mostly what we're thinking about is how do you focus on the work that you have to do? How do you prioritize that work when new things are coming in all the time? And how do you stay motivated to keep doing it consistently?
Motivation. That is something we all need in our work because while everybody would love to have a job that they love, that motivates them all the time, it is difficult to stay motivated to do the things that you maybe don't want to do. What are some of those motivation challenges for the ADHD brain when you get hit with a task that just isn't that exciting?
One of the things that we see in the research is, and this is still a theory, I will say neuroscience and ADHD is still very developing, but, there seems to be this spike that you get when you're neurotypical, so you don't have ADHD, and you are trying to start a task. And that little spike goes, well done, you're starting a task. There's going to be a reward at the end of this. Go you. And when you are ADHD, you start a task and your brain looks at you and goes, what are we doing? This is stupid. Like, do something else. And we don't get that little bump. Our brain doesn't do that. So we often need to add to it. So that sometimes people say, I feel like I am lazy, I'm not doing it. And what we're looking at is actually your brain chemicals are just doing different things in different ways. That's the best way we can seem to understand it right now. And so what that means for you is you need to add dopamine, and I'll talk about how to do that in a second, but you need to add it to get to the same place. You're just being underpaid, basically.
Underpaid in rewards, not necessarily
underpaid
money,
in
right?
rewards. In the world of the brain dopamine systems, you're getting paid $5 and they're getting paid $10, and that's why you're not that motivated.
What are some of those dopamine treats we can give ourselves? Because I can imagine this might be applicable very widely, beyond the ADHD brain to anyone who's lacking motivation to do a specific task.
100%. And I will say, when I worked with the New Zealand intelligence services, because they said, we have a lot of ADHD people. So I did workshops with them, and then also the district health board. In both those cases, once they learned these strategies, they did say, this is going to be really useful for everybody. Like, it's not just ADHD. It's just everyone has a down day, like you said, but we struggle with it the most. So in terms of what that looks like, I actually ended up taking all the research and everything I've done and turning it into a program called Focused Balance Days. And so when we're thinking about this idea of inconsistent to consistent, which is really what we're talking about here, it's about adding in sensory things and stacking those sensory things. And the reason I say sensory is because often people will say, a reward. Yeah, I can't just eat chocolate for the rest of my life. Like, this isn't going to help me. And so what I'll say is, okay, think of all 5 of your senses. We've got taste, sure, but we've also got touch and smell and sight. And often we're actually understimulated, not overstimulated like a lot of people think. Maybe we're overstimulated because we're reading something, or, we're watching something on TikTok or whatever it is. And so we're very overstimulated. But you might be sitting on your bed, super uncomfortable. You might be, or like at your desk, you might be not smelling anything, not looking, you might be looking at a blank wall. So as a holistic view, we might actually want to increase our stimulation. So if you were talking about a workplace, for example, you might say, okay, what can I bring to work that I can touch, that I can taste, that I can smell, that I can see, that's going to help just raise the level of stimulation to help me stay focused at work.
So if I work in an office, let's just take that for example, because there are many different work environments that we can explore here.
Yeah.
If I'm someone who has to go to an office, whether that's 5 days a week or just part of the time, does that mean maybe strategically planning to go to the break room and get some coffee?
Well, yes, that's a really great start, but I would also say, what can you have at your desk? And this is tricky if you're in an office, less so than it used to be. When I first started, it was just like very difficult. But, I would ask, can you bring to work a really cool fidget that looks like a keyring? Even a Rubik's Cube, they're appropriate for even the most intense workplaces. Things like that.
You could fidget with that while you're on a call.
Exactly.
Assuming you don't need to take notes or something like that.
You could, or just the note taking can be a fidget as well. You can sort of doodle on like one page and write on the other if you want to. If you're in a position where you may be looking at a blank wall, can we add anything to the wall? Can we put in one of those holographic pictures that like changes depending on where you're looking? Like things like that, just to add something to the space. You're probably not going to be able to do anything about smell in an office, but you could see if you can use headphones. Maybe you don't want to use the big headphones because they're going to be distracting. Maybe that's just not your company culture, but maybe you could put one headphone in. I've done a lot of this in my own life. The power of putting one headphone in, so at least you're somewhat distracted. I actually use that all the time when I go to the doctor's office. I'm not a huge medical doctor person, so having one headphone in, listening to some music or a podcast, it kind of just gives you a little bit of something. So things like that can really help.
Could the headphone in one ear or both ears, could that just be for noise? Or is it generally for listening to something as well?
It's whatever you want it to be. So you can use the little loop earplugs if you just want something that's going to like reduce the sound. But there's also a ton of really nice little earphones that could be Bluetooth connected to your phone, and you can just tap it if you want to turn it off. So you could theoretically be listening to a podcast or music or something like that. And if somebody sort of comes up to you, one earphone in, you can still hear them, and you can just tap their headphone and, chat, and it can be quite subtle in that way.
Have you ever heard of people maybe asking to sit in a different place because the place that they sat in was too highly trafficked and was distracting? I mean, is that a thing?
That's a huge thing. I hear that a lot. And then I hear a lot of people being told that that's not an option, or if we did that for you, we'd have to do that for everybody. So it can be very political, that kind of conversation. If you can find a way to get a workplace that's optimal for you, then definitely ask about it. And usually when you're asking about it, what I recommend you do is you say, I want to do X, whatever the goal of your company is. Doing this is going to help me do it better, faster, whatever. Align what you want with the goals of the company. That usually helps you get what you need.
Right, because the overall goal for you is to be less distracted, more productive, which helps you, and it helps your company.
Yeah, you could be in a busy traffic area and just chat to everybody all day and get super distracted. It's not going to be great for the workplace, so that's kind of the key.
Yeah, a lot of times if you're in that first cubicle for a department, let's just say, that somebody walks by, you're the one that's going to be the most distracted or have the most people come up and talk to you.
Exactly.
What about if I also have to work from home? Are there things you've seen people do to their work environment at the house to kind of support this idea of minimizing distractions, but also increasing the number of different sensations they can have available?
This is a tricky one because when you're talking about the workplace, often you're talking about sort of external distractions. When you're talking about the home, we can still be talking about external distractions, but we're more talking about internal motivation because everything can feel more important than the work. And the amount of people I hear say things like, well, I would, but I just have to clean my room, and I would, but I just have to do the dishes. So there's a lot of times where you will procrastinativity at home is what I would say. You still do it at work as well, but like particularly at home, we love procrastinativity, which is doing something productive and procrastinating on that. If you just want to message me on Instagram at Unconventional Organization, message me, say Nerd Journey Focus, and I'll send you the doc of what I'm about to explain. Basically, what you do is you want to go ahead and you want to step into focus at home. That's really, really important. So you want to go through and work through the steps of that resistance, because while you're at work, you're going to be body doubling with other people, which is really, really helpful. But when you're at home, you're going to be finding yourself often working by yourself. The body doubling won't be there, or it even might be the opposite. You might have other people around you or out in the other room doing other things. So you're going to want to have a space that's specifically for work and throw a blanket over anything that's distracting you, or just move it away, like put it in another room, all that stuff you want to organize. And then you want to go ahead and you want to step into focus using a series of steps that helps you go from that I'm very distracted, I don't want to do this sucks, to that I'm actually working, I'm actually focused space.
So you want not too much clutter.
Yeah.
Because then you might want to organize it, right?
Yeah.
And not too much blank space on the walls, because then you're going to feel like you have to have stuff on them or wondering why they're so plain, right?
I get the clutter question a lot. But yeah, I would say you don't want too much clutter, but you don't want this to be a thing. So like, don't be like that person who's like, right, so what Skye is telling me is that I need to organize so I don't have too much clutter and then I'll get work done. That is not what I mean. Shove it in a back closet. Just don't have it in front of you and distracting you. But then when you're actually doing the work, number one thing, especially when we're at home, if we're going to do the step into focus, is we want to reward ourselves for starting. So saying, okay, I'm going to sit at my desk with the intention of working. And as a reward for doing that, so for some of you, it might be you get up from your desk, you like make a coffee or something, and you sit back down and you're like, right, I'm going to work now. The first thing we want to do is we want to do some kind of dopamine reward for starting. So that might be something like, I'm going to read an article and listen to music and have a cup of tea. That's kind of the first thing. So you want to kind of ease into it. And so, sometimes people say like, that seems silly. Like, why would I give myself a reward for starting? I'm like, well, I don't know if you noticed this, but you spent 2 hours on the couch scrolling because you were like, I'm going to give myself, I just need what I need. So like, just give yourself 10 minutes, read the article, have the coffee. It's fine.
Do you find that if people are listening to music, does it need to be music without words or anything so that they can maintain a focus on their work? Or does it really matter in the people you've spoken to?
This is a good question. So this relates to the idea of the dopamine detox. You might have seen there's a lot of conversations about we need a dopamine detox and all that kind of stuff. And with ADHD, I actually recommend we dial down our dopamine. We don't turn it off, because the truth is we're unlikely to actually just go from 100 to 0 when it comes to dopamine. It's too much. So what I recommend, if you're doing the step into focus, for example, and maybe you're reading an article, maybe the next thing you do is you go ahead and you switch to a podcast, or you switch to music with lyrics, and you turn off any distractions at that point, and maybe you go ahead and write down the task that you're going to do during this period of work. That really supports your working memory. It's like super important step to a step into focus routine. And then at that point, you might say, okay, well, I'm not as distracted as I was when I was reading. I'm listening to something. But now I want to actually open the application and start tinkering around with it. So maybe I'm going to switch at that point. I'm going to switch to music without lyrics because it's going to be too distracting for me. So I like to imagine it as turning down the dial. You have a big dial, one of those old school dials with like the clicks, and you're like adjusting the dial. You're saying, okay, this is my level of distraction. So I'm not going to suddenly try and sit in silence. That's never going to work. I'm going to instead try listening to a podcast, because I would probably do that. And then once I'm more focused, I might turn off that and switch to music with lyrics and etc.
Do you have any thoughts on number of screens? Is 2 monitors too distracting?
Actually, I really like 2 monitors because of working memory. So with ADHD, we really struggle with working memory. And so switching between tabs can actually be quite difficult. I don't know if you've ever seen someone get really stuck because they can't remember what was on the first tab and then they click on the second tab. And so if you have 2 screens with ADHD, you can look at both, and that can actually really support your working memory.
Didn't realize. Mm-hmm. That's super cool. Is a reward or a possible working environment that helps you, like going to a coffee shop or somewhere where you can just park and work and put on headphones, or is that too distracting because you might have people walking around and doing other things?
That's great. It really depends on the situation. some people find that overstimulating. The thing about ADHD, I will say, is that different scenarios are different levels of stimulation for different people. With ADHD, it also depends on the tasks. So my recommendation is always like have a toolbox of different environments that you want to work in and adjust it based on you. But for a lot of people, working in a coffee shop can be really helpful. It can be actually the difference between getting something written and not getting something written. I know for myself, I do all my writing in coffee shops because it's too distracting to do it at home. But if I'm in a coffee shop and I have a coffee in front of me, I have the stimulation I need to step into focus. So it really depends on the person. But if that works for you, I would say keep doing it. The price of the coffee is worth it.
Sounds like we need to step into this with a mindset of experimentation. Would you encourage people to journal how productive they felt as they go through these things? Or
that's a really great question. One, I will say experimentation 100%. The thing I always say to people is I want you to commit to experimentation. That's what I ask for commitment when people work with me, because things aren't going to work 100% of the time. What we're committing to is trying and adjusting when we know what is working, what isn't working. It's like a big tangled ball of wool or string, and we're pulling it apart. And as we do that, things can be attached to other things, and so we might need to make adjustments. So experimentation is huge. Of course, it sucks experimenting when you don't have the strategies and the systems to know what's going wrong. So when you do have that, then it gets fun.
One area where you might have to experiment a lot is if your job is travel heavy. As a result of the pandemic, some people in roles that used to be travel heavy maybe still have an element of travel, but it's not as much. But we certainly do still see people who have to deal with a lot of travel. And that could be local travel. I need to drive somewhere for a meeting with someone or multiple meetings around town. It could be air travel as well. Are there certain things that we might need to focus on to help ourselves stay structured in the travel, making sure that we're on time?
Yeah, so travel is really, really tricky with ADHD because there's a lot of moving parts. So I think when you are traveling, it depends on what you're trying to do. So the number one thing I would say is keep your routine and just adjust it. I recommend people have routines they can stretch and squish down, so they can sort of stretch it out or squish it down. So for example, if you say every morning I wake up and I journal, which I do think is really helpful. I write something down and I, maybe have coffee and I, have breakfast and do some movement, which is great for your working memory. If you're traveling, then you might say, I'm going to make this I just write one word and I grab something and I go ahead and I sort of do 10 jumping jacks or something like that. It can be fun. So that's kind of a very squished down version, but you're keeping the routine. You're not breaking the routine. This is also really helpful for the holidays. That keeps your routine. And then when you're talking about being late for things, it's really about planning it out. So sometimes when people travel, they sort of decide to give up all of the ADHD strategies that they've learned at work. We're always ADHD all the time. So you want to be using those strategies whether you're at work, whether you're on holiday. It's the same thing. You want to go ahead and schedule into your calendar what you're going to do and schedule transition times as well. Because with ADHD, we really struggle with transitions and we love to think we can teleport, but we can't. So we want to go ahead and we want to say, okay, what does it look like for me to go to this place by this time? What is the travel? Let me add that into the calendar. What is the leave time? Let me add that into the calendar. What is the prep time? And that can also help with things like waiting mode. But essentially, if you don't do that, you end up super late all the time or super early all the time. One of those two is us struggling with figuring out how to deal with the transition times.
And probably a giant stress ball as well.
Giant stress ball running around what's going on? What's next? Where am I? And that can really suck when you turn up and you know that you're late. Or I've had a lot of people say, I'm never late, but I'm always almost late. And that feels very stressful as a life.
Sure. I liked what you said about having a routine each morning, or maybe you have routines before you do certain activities even. Is the routine mainly to provide structure? Is it to kind of calm yourself for the day, how would you describe the purpose of the routine?
That's a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. People are always like, what's the routine? They never ask me, why is the routine? Yeah, so the purpose of the routine is emotional regulation, just physical support, if you eat and things like that. Everyone has different views on that stuff, but essentially, making sure
I support
you're fueled.
breakfast.
Yeah, you're fueled. And then also movement for working memory is really important. So we know from the research that movement supports working memory. If you have ADHD, you probably want to get some movement in because you're about to be sitting probably down for a very long time. And then some kind of dopamine, because what's the point in a morning if it doesn't have some fun in it? And why would you get up unless it's got some fun in it? So those are the sort of 4 things I would say you should have in the morning.
Does the journaling also increase dopamine if you're doing like a brain dump on something or on a specific topic?
So the journaling is interesting. There's a growing understanding of ADHD and emotional dysregulation. And there's a lot of understanding about like reducing, relaxing, calming, grounding, all of those things being important. I will say that I personally enjoy journaling. I do not like personally just quietly listening to my brain, but I have some, one of my former coaches, now podcast producer, doesn't love journaling. She finds that very stressful and she'd prefer to mindfully do something. So I would say whichever form of mindfulness works for you, as long as you are in some way just paying attention to your brain, what's going on, trying to like reduce and release all of those thoughts that might be stuck in there and helping you kind of move through so that you can feel a bit more calm. And this is just something I think everybody should be doing.
If you like personal development, I know Brendan Burchard talks about it constantly, how journaling has been scientifically proven to decrease stress levels. I just didn't know if there was like a specific type of journaling that perhaps the ADHD brain should focus on. Is it dump out everything in your brain, like a morning pages mentality? Is it pick a random topic? Maybe that's more stressful. Pick a specific topic.
In my podcast, ADHD Skills Lab, we talk about research all the time, which is just my way of being held accountable for making sure I learn all this stuff. But there doesn't seem to be any particular evidence on a particular kind of journaling or anything like that right now. If you want to know what I do the morning pages system. So just like writing freehand, that kind of thing. It's all just about getting to a place where you have a little bit more distance between your thoughts and your actions. Because when you have ADHD, we are more impulsive. There seems to be a bit less of a, we should hold on to this. We're just like, this is how I feel. This is how I'm acting. This is what's happening. And so we just want to take a minute in the morning if we can and just remind ourselves about that separation. And that's really what the purpose is.
In communication, is there a specific medium that a working person with ADHD might prefer more than others? Is it going to be email or perhaps text or a call or maybe even an instant message type thing? How would you rank those on like a preference scale, you think?
That's a really great question. What I'll say is that there isn't one that's particularly good for everybody with ADHD, but most people with ADHD will have a particular preference that they'll hold on to very, very strongly. One of the reasons potentially for this, and I don't have the research on this, I sort of do, but we know with ADHD, there's a lot of learning difficulties that kind of can be connected. So people might have dyscalculia, people might have dyslexia, people might have something else that we haven't even got a name for right now. And so they will probably be the kind of people who are like, if I'm not writing it down, I don't remember it. Or if I'm not hearing it, I don't remember it. Or if I don't say it, I'm not going to do it. I can't write it down. And some people are like, I can only write it down. As soon as I have to say it out loud, I get all jumbled up. So usually people will have, once they really think about it, they'll have 1 or 2 methods that they really appreciate. And so this is sometimes where it comes to understanding the person. In my business, I'm often working with people who are supporting entrepreneurs. And so it's about going, okay, if you're communicating to a team, how do you do that? And so if you're using Slack, for example, Slack can be really great because you can send an audio message, but it can have a transcript of that audio message. Maybe don't send audio messages over platforms where they don't do that, because then somebody has to listen to it and they might not be an auditory receiver. They might be wanting to read it, for example.
My wife's never been diagnosed with ADHD, but I've heard her say before, I would much rather read the blog article than have to scroll to the right part of the video to get the information I want.
Exactly. So having multiple ways, and the great news is this has never been easier. If you use a lot of the apps now where you could say, have a video that people could also listen to and it comes with a transcript, like these are the ways that you can communicate more and more.
Should we expect our colleagues with ADHD that's been diagnosed or those types of challenges to share that with us when we're talking about how to best communicate with them? Or do we need to get better at asking about what they need?
I love that question. I think, honestly, one of the things people need to understand is that often people with ADHD don't have any idea about how this stuff works either. This is something that they're learning too. This is a very new area. And so often it's, they might not even realize that about themselves. And so sometimes it's just about understanding people and saying, hey, I've noticed that you never respond to my messages when they're written. If you guys are going out to eat and somebody never eats a certain type of food, they're always leaving that one on their plate and they're always eating the other food, you might go, hey, this is the 5th time we've been out to eat. Should we not order that one? I'm not eating it either. So that kind of conversation around how you communicate is going to be helpful with ADHD, because that person might be like, oh, you're right. I always thought that, we always just get fries with that, but I'm not eating the fries. You're not eating the fries. Maybe we just don't do the fries, So this is something that you want to be thinking about in that way as well, because the reason people often come to me is because they find out they have ADHD and then they say, what do I do? And then everyone says, I don't know. And then they come to me and I tell them. So unless they're doing something like that, they might have no idea either.
Yeah, I like your analogy about maybe they don't like the Brussels sprouts that they always leave behind.
Context clues.
That's right. Is there a way that the ADHD brain manages maybe the push notifications of our modern time a little bit better so that it's not always distracting them? Because, you might get a push notification from your email or an instant message or text or whatever application you have it allowed for.
Well, I mean, you might not know what I'm going to say, which is that push notifications are terrible and they should be removed immediately. I'm not a fan of them. Most of the time, what I'd recommend is people have a rhythm to their day. And the reason that I talk about and teach about focused, balanced days and focused, balanced business growth is because a good day makes a good life. And with ADHD, it's hard to remember things if you're saying, oh, every other day I do this. I'm like, I don't even know what day it is. How am I supposed to know which other day is the one that I do this on? So if we're thinking about just a day, then when you're the kind of person who's set up a day and you go, okay, this email always needs, or this, phone number always needs to be available. This is how I reach my family or whatever it is. You have those kinds of things. But for everything else, I check my emails around this time of the day. I always do a responding to email after lunch, or I do this at this time of the day and I don't do this. Decide your rhythm for checking things and then turn off all of the notifications except for the emergency contact detail one. That would be my recommendation when it comes to push notifications. Just aggressively remove them from every single app you get, every single thing you get.
So you're saying that I shouldn't keep my email open in that tab next to everything else. Okay.
You're like, why am I getting nothing done? Immediately reflexively clicks on the thing. And also, if you have removed it, but you have gotten to the place where you automatically, and you'll know if you do this, you reflexively turn on the thing before you've even done anything. Yeah, remove it from where you're putting it. So move the app around, like take it off the immediate start bar of your phone or the bookmarks bar of your computer if it's an app you're trying to stop checking as much.
Oh, I like that. That's good. When people go from all the notifications to pretty much none of the notifications, does that appear to be this weird lull in communication from other people they interact with? Or maybe some people manage the transition better than others?
I mean, I think that's a good point. If you are going to do this in a workplace scenario, you might want to go ahead and have a little bit of a communication, similar to the conversation about moving desks. It's sort of the digital version of moving desks. You might want to have a conversation about that, but I always come back to with clients when I'm working with them, as I say, what is your job? Is your job to respond within 10 minutes to every single message And maybe that is your job, in which case we will have to have a different discussion. But for most people, their job is to do the thing. So if people find out that like to do the thing, I need to check my messages, every 2 hours, but I'm going to turn it off when it's not those 2 hours unless you call me on this number. Most people are going to be fine with that. The biggest problem you're actually going to have is that now the source of dopamine that you were using and justifying, which was checking your email, is now gone. So you might have to dial down your dopamine. The most stimulating thing you might be doing all day is checking your emails. So maybe we have to say, I'm going to listen to more podcasts in the background while I work, because actually what you didn't realize, because I've done this before, I had to learn this, was that I was procrastinating around checking my emails, checking my analytics, checking all of those things. But actually that was just an excuse for me not to do things and to let the dopamine just do its thing. If you spend all your time searching for the perfect app, 1, it's about the process, not the app. 2, this might be procrastinating. Just keep an eye on that as well.
Is that something that people really have trouble overcoming with ADHD, the procrastination?
Yeah, if you have ADHD, you could almost call ADHD struggles with procrastination. Like that could almost be an alternative title for ADHD. Because when we're talking about executive functioning, which, by the way, there is no agreed upon definition of what is executive functioning, just as a side note. When you're talking about the general idea of like working memory and time blindness and all of those things, one of the reasons we procrastinate is the thing is too boring, the thing is too emotionally salient, as in the last time I sent that email, I got yelled at, I don't want to do it again, or it's too confusing. And so sometimes rather than addressing or understanding these are the reasons I'm not doing this project, we will just go off on a million different side quests and never come back to the project.
But all the side quests make us feel like we've done something. Procrastinativity is what you called it?
Exactly. Actually, if you want to just message me Nerd Journey Prioritization on Instagram, just message me, Nerd Journey Prioritization Unconventional Organization. I'll send you a doc on that because there is a prioritization filter. And when I'm working with clients or with anybody, often the first thing we have to do is we have to move all of that stuff, all of that like, but I'd feel bad if I didn't do it. And like I said, I would do it. And there's no real deadline and it doesn't really matter, so that we can actually look at what we have to do. Because I've done this prioritization filter so many times with people. And I will say, if you have more than 5 things to do today and more than 10 things to do this week, you're probably not prioritizing correctly. Most of us only have that number. We could have some subtasks, maybe, but for most of us, that should be the number that we're working at. And I haven't seen 90% of people, I haven't seen go over that number once they do the filtering.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. If I showed you my to-do list right now, this is what it looks like. There's more than 5 to 10 things. So yeah, that would
be my question would be, what can we delegate? What can we at least catch and release back to the person that we, maybe we were super excited to take on that task and now we want to give it back and say, hey, could you actually do like some of the initial stuff and then I'll come to the meeting? Things like that. And then what needs to be done today, or there will be a significant external negative consequence. And if that's not the case, then it doesn't have to be done today. It could be done today. It might be that it's important and you want to do it today. We can bring it back in, but we don't have to run around with this like, it has to be done today or everything's going to fall apart, because it doesn't have a significant external negative consequence.
Right. You said that in your own head.
Yeah.
That it needed to be done today, and you're putting the pressure on.
Yeah. And I am that person. Like I've had my husband will always laugh about this, because I was classic, especially in academia. I'd be like, I'll get it done by Friday. And they'd be like, okay. And then on Friday, I'd be like working late into the night to finish this thing. And then he'd come along and be like, why are you doing this? Like, who is this for? And I'd be like, it's for me. And he's like, did they say Friday? I'm like, no, but like I have time blindness, as it turns out. And so everything could be done by Friday.
And part of it may just be, well, I said I would.
Yeah.
And if I don't do what I said, then everybody's going to think I can't hit my deadlines. And
it's a real trap with ADHD because we have time blindness. So often the deadlines we're creating were unrealistic to start with. Actually, that's one of the things people often ask me about workplaces. What's the one thing you can do in a workplace? The number one thing you can do is put a clock where the speaker is. If you're having a meeting, so that they can see time passing. Because if you want someone to have a 5-minute conversation and they can't tell the time, they're not going to look at their watch during this conversation. So the more you can externalize time, like put fun clocks, interesting clocks, a whole bunch of stuff around you, the more people can see time passing, the less likely they are to get time blind.
Yeah. I know we talked about stress a little bit earlier and how the ADHD brain handles it. I'd like to talk about stress in the context of the current job market. So have you turned off your push notifications yet after listening to that discussion with Skye? I really liked her message of managing our notifications to give us more periods of focus. This is really about doing that deep work that Cal Newport wrote about in his book, Deep Work, that we also reviewed in episodes 141 through 147. And if you listen carefully, that dopamine hit of productivity that we get when we check our email or social media or some other system is really what John Acuff calls a hiding place in his book, Finish. It's something that gets in the way of us achieving our goals. We talked about hiding places in episode 273, but in the context of this episode, the goal is get the work accomplished each day while you have the time. You just need to make sure you're doing the right things. But it's not about walling yourself off from the world and being completely unavailable either. Skye's advice would be measured somewhat and adjusted based on your job role, because it's about how can we get more periods of focus to perform the responsibilities we have to do. So if your responsibilities are being super responsive, the way you focus in your prioritization filter might be slightly different than what we talked about in this discussion. That might be a reason to seek out a coach like Skye. Remember to reach out to Skye if you want the documents on the prioritization filter or how to step into focus. There are some really good blog articles on the Unconventional Organization website that I linked to in the show notes. It's also worth just checking out the blog. A lot of good content out there. And remember, don't forget to check out the ADHD Skills Lab podcast that Skye hosts. Go out there, give it a listen, rate them 5 stars, give them a review, and tell them the Nerd Journey crew sent them your way. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our discussion with Skye. Next week, we'll pick up the discussion about the ADHD brain and stress. See you then.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.